Welcome back, UPSC aspirants, to part 2 of our deep dive into current affairs for April 2nd, 2025.
That's right. We're back for more.
Hopefully you're staying ahead of the game by listening to these deep dives.
Absolutely.
And, maybe even some of what we discussed today will sound a bit familiar.
A little bit of revision never hurts, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you are finding these deep dives helpful on your UPSC journey, then you know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe.
Please do. It really helps us out.
So today, we're going to try to extract, the core understanding from a really broad range of recent events
That's right. We've got a lot to cover.
that we think are going to be relevant for your UPSC aspirations.
Absolutely.
We've got international agreements, we've got technological advancements, legal pronouncements,
Economic policies, environmental initiatives.
the whole gamut.
The whole shebang.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
A big one recently. We just passed the 50th anniversary of the Biological Weapons Convention.
That's right. A really significant milestone.
Yeah.
It's formally known as the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Bacteriological, Biological, and Toxin Weapons, and on their destruction.
Catchy.
Yeah, quite a mouthful. But, they wanted to be very specific about what they were prohibiting.
So for our listeners who are, maybe brushing up on this, could we clarify what exactly do we mean by biological and toxin weapons?
Sure. So essentially we're talking about either living organisms like viruses, bacteria, fungi, or poisonous substances that are produced by living things.
Okay.
The key here is that they're deliberately used to cause disease or death in humans, animals, or plants.
Okay.
Some examples would be things like anthrax, botulinum toxin, and plague.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so pretty nasty stuff.
And this is, a nearly universal agreement.
It is, yeah. We've got 188 states parties to this convention, including India.
Okay.
But there are, some challenges.
Yeah.
Because how do you really verify compliance? And also some of these technologies have dual uses. So it's important to understand these ongoing issues to really appreciate, how relevant this convention still is.
Yeah.
Because we're facing, new and evolving biological risks all the time.
And, even thinking about the potential consequences of their use is pretty scary.
Oh, absolutely. It would be devastating.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have huge food shortages, environmental damage, economic instability, and of course, widespread fear.
It's like out of a movie.
Exactly, a dystopian nightmare.
So at its core, what is it about this convention that makes it so vital?
Well, it's the complete ban, the prohibition on developing, producing, acquiring, transferring, stockpiling, and of course, using these weapons.
Oh, right.
So it's a really comprehensive agreement, and it was negotiated in Geneva.
Okay.
And, it really strengthens this global, opposition to these weapons of mass destruction.
Mm-hmm. And it's also building on an earlier agreement, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It supplements the 1925 Geneva Protocol,
Right.
which only prohibited the use of biological weapons. So the BWC goes much further. It outlaws their very existence.
Okay, so let's shift gears completely and talk about something that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction.
All right, what do we got?
Neuralink's Blindsight chip.
Ah, yes. This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So Neuralink, which is Elon Musk's neurotechnology company,
Yeah.
they're aiming to actually implant this Blindsight chip in a human for the first time, possibly as early as next year.
Wow. And this project has already gotten some attention from regulators, hasn't it?
It has. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has given it this breakthrough device designation,
Okay.
which basically means they're going to speed up the development and the review process.
Okay, so how does this Blindsight technology actually work?
Well, Blindsight is a type of brain-computer interface, or BCI,
Okay.
and it's implanted, and it seeks to restore vision.
Okay.
Now, the way it does this is by bypassing a damaged retina and directly stimulating the visual cortex.
Okay. For our listeners who, might need a little reminder, could we talk about what the visual cortex is and why it's so important for sight?
Sure. So the visual cortex is this area right at the back of your brain
Okay.
in the cerebral cortex. And it's basically the main processing center for all the visual information that your eyes send, through the retinas.
Okay.
So it's the part of your brain that actually makes sense of what you're seeing.
So this chip is somehow communicating directly with that part of the brain.
Exactly. So Blindsight uses this microelectrode array,
Okay.
which is basically a grid of tiny, tiny electrodes
Mm-hmm.
that are surgically implanted into the visual cortex.
Wow.
And then this array can stimulate neurons,
Okay.
which are the nerve cells in your brain that transmit signals.
Okay.
And this basically provides artificial visual input.
So we keep mentioning this BCI brain-computer interface.
Right.
Could you give us like a quick overview of what that is and what are the potential applications?
Sure. So a BCI is a system that interprets brain activity and translates it into commands for external devices or software.
Okay.
So, for example, someone with paralysis could use a BCI to control a prosthetic limb or a computer cursor just by thinking.
That's amazing.
It is, yeah. And beyond healthcare applications like that,
Mm-hmm.
BCIs have potential in areas like communication controlling smart environments.
Wow.
Even commercial applications like gaming and maybe even transportation interfaces someday.
This is all so exciting. But of course, with such advanced technology, there are always some questions.
Of course, there are always concerns.
Yeah.
I mean, how usable are these implants? Will people be able to adapt to them and use them effectively? And then, of course, there's safety.
Right.
Is there a risk of tissue damage during implantation?
Mm-hmm.
What about seizures? And what are the long-term effects on brain function? We just don't know yet.
Yeah, it's like the Wild West.
It really is. It's a brave new world.
Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about a really interesting development in legal philosophy within India.
Okay, what's that?
The Supreme Court seems to be increasingly adopting an eco-centric approach.
That's right. And this is something you should definitely be aware of for your UPSC exams.
Okay.
The Supreme Court is giving more and more recognition to the intrinsic value of nature,
Okay.
which is a pretty big shift from a purely human-centered view. It's moving towards an approach that prioritizes the entire ecosystem.
Could you explain a bit more about what this eco-centric approach actually means?
Sure. So it's basically a philosophy that emphasizes that everything's interconnected.
Okay.
All non-living things in an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that nature has value just for existing.
Okay.
It's not just valuable because it's useful to humans.
Right.
And it prioritizes the health and sustainability of the whole ecological web.
Okay. So how has the Supreme Court actually put this philosophy into practice?
Well, there have been a number of key judgments that illustrate this shift.
Mm-hmm.
One really important case was the T.N. Godavarman Thirmal Pad versus Union of India back in 1996. And in this case, the court expanded the definition of forest
Okay.
to include any area that resembles a forest, even if it's not officially classified as one.
That's pretty significant.
It is, yeah. It showed that they were serious about protecting all green cover,
Mm-hmm.
not just areas that the government had labeled as forests.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, then in 1998, there was the case of Center for Environmental Law, WWFIV, Union of India.
Okay.
And in this case, the Supreme Court directed the government to really enforce conservation measures
Mm-hmm.
and to actually implement the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972.
So they weren't messing around.
Not at all. They were making it clear that they wanted action, not just words.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the NR Nirvi Union of India case in 2000.
Oh.
And this case upheld that animals are sentient beings
Mm-hmm.
and that they have the right to live with dignity and free from unnecessary suffering.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a really important recognition of animal rights.
Mm.
And then maybe one of the most famous examples of this eco-centric view is the Animal Welfare Board of India VA Nagaraja case from 2014.
Okay.
And in this case, the Supreme Court prioritized animal welfare over traditional human practices like Jallikattu.
Right.
So it was a really significant decision. And the Supreme Court has been using its powers under Article 32,
Mm-hmm.
which is about fundamental rights,
Okay.
and Article 142,
Right.
which gives it the authority to pass orders for complete justice,
Mm.
to really put these eco-centric interpretations into practice.
So let's move on to the economic front and talk about this surge in advanced pricing agreements or APAs.
Yeah, there's been a lot of activity in this area.
Yeah, so the CBDT has signed a record number of APAs this past financial year.
That's right, 174 in 2024-25,
Wow.
which is up from 125 the year before.
Okay, so for our listeners, who are prepping for those exams, when were these APA provisions first introduced in India?
So the Ministry of Finance brought them in with the Finance Act of 2012.
Okay.
And they added sections 9(2)cc and 9(2)cd to the Income Tax Act of 1961.
Can you break down for us what an advanced pricing agreement actually is?
Sure. So basically an APA is a formal agreement between a taxpayer and the tax authority, in this case the CBDT.
Mm-hmm.
And its purpose is to establish in advance what's an acceptable transfer pricing methodology
Okay.
for determining the arm's length price for international transactions between associated enterprises.
Right. And could you explain what arm's length price means in this context?
Yeah, so basically it's the price that would be charged if the same transaction happened between two companies that weren't related,
Okay.
like two independent parties under comparable circumstances.
Oh, yeah.
So the APA wants to make sure that transactions between related companies are priced like they were dealing at arm's length to prevent tax avoidance.
So how long do these APAs typically last?
The maximum duration is 5 years from the date it starts.
Okay.
But there's no minimum period.
Okay. And there are different types of APAs as well, right?
That's right. You have unilateral APAs,
Okay.
which involve just the taxpayer and the tax authority of one country.
Right.
Then there are bilateral APAs,
Okay.
which involve the taxpayer, their associated enterprise in another country, and the tax authorities of both countries.
Wow.
And then you have multilateral APAs,
Okay.
which involve the taxpayer associated enterprises in multiple foreign countries and all the tax authorities involved.
So for businesses, what are the benefits of getting an APA?
Well, APAs help reduce the risk of double taxation, which can happen when different countries have different views on transfer pricing.
Yep.
And they also help lower compliance costs for businesses by providing certainty and reducing the chance of getting audited or having disputes.
So it's a win-win.
Ideally, yes.
Okay, so let's stay in the realm of finance and policy and talk about a pretty big anniversary for India's central banking institution.
All right, what's the occasion?
This year is the 90th anniversary of the Reserve Bank of India's very first monetary policy announcement back in 1935.
Wow, 90 years. That's a long time.
Yeah, so for our listeners who might be, refreshing their knowledge, can you define what we mean by monetary policy?
Sure. So monetary policy is basically all the actions a central bank takes to manage the money supply and credit conditions in an economy.
Okay.
The goal is to either stimulate or restrain economic activity depending on what's needed.
So what are the main goals that guide the RBI's decisions about monetary policy?
Well, the main objectives are usually to maintain price stability. So keep inflation under control,
Okay.
promote sustainable economic growth,
Right.
and ensure the financial system as a whole is stable.
So what are the tools that the RBI uses to actually implement monetary policy?
They have a whole range of tools, which we can broadly categorize as quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative tools include things like the repo rate, the reverse repo rate, the statutory liquidity ratio, or SLR, and the marginal standing facility, or MSF.
Okay.
These tools directly influence how much money is available and how much it costs to borrow.
Right.
Qualitative tools are more about persuasion or direction, like moral suasion, where the RBI tries to persuade banks to follow certain guidelines, and direct action, which can involve more forceful measures if needed.
So the RBI has a lot of options.
They do, yes.
And they can take different approaches with their monetary policy, right?
That's right. There are broadly two main approaches or stances.
Okay.
You have contractionary or tight monetary policy, which aims to reduce inflation by increasing interest rates and reducing the money supply.
Okay. Is that another one?
The other one is expansionary monetary policy, which tries to stimulate economic growth by lowering interest rates and increasing the amount of credit available.
So the framework for making monetary policy in India has changed over time, hasn't it?
It has. Before 2016, the governor of the RBI had a lot of power in shaping monetary policy. But then in 2016, there was a change to the Reserve Bank of India Act of 1934. And this created the Monetary Policy Committee, or MPC, which is a statutory and institutionalized body.
Okay.
And it also formally adopted a framework of flexible inflation targeting.
So can you explain a bit more about the MPC and how it works?
Sure. So the MPC has 6 members.
Okay.
3 are nominated by the RBI, and 3 are appointed by the central government. The RBI governor is the chairperson.
Okay.
And each member gets 1 vote, and if there's a tie, the governor has a casting vote.
Okay.
The MPC's job is to set the benchmark policy interest rate, which is the repo rate, and they also publish a monetary policy report regularly.
Okay, now let's talk about another development related to taxation, this expansion of safe harbor rules.
Right, the CBDT has been busy.
They've issued notifications that amend the income tax rules of 1962 to expand the use of safe harbor provisions in transfer pricing.
Okay.
So what exactly has changed?
Well, for one thing, they've increased the threshold for total turnover.
Okay.
For companies that want to use safe harbor from 200 crore rupees to 300 crore rupees.
Yeah.
And they've also expanded the definition of core auto components to include lithium-ion batteries for electric or hybrid vehicles.
So for our listeners who are new to this, what is a safe harbor in terms of transfer pricing?
Sure. So in transfer pricing, a safe harbor basically gives you a set of rules
Okay.
that if you follow them, the tax authority will accept the transfer price you declared as being at arm's length.
Okay.
So it gives you some certainty and reduces the risk of getting audited or having disputes.
Okay, so let's shift gears again and talk about infrastructure development in India. Specifically, the Kosi-Mechi Intrastate Link project.
All right, this is a big one.
It is. So the Union Cabinet recently approved this project in Bihar, and it's being included under the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana Accelerated Irrigation Benefits Program.
Or PMKSY AIBP for short.
All right, so when is this project supposed to be finished, and what are its main goals?
They're aiming to complete it by 2029.
Okay.
And the main goals are to improve irrigation and flood management in Bihar.
Okay, how will it do that?
The basic idea is to divert surplus water from the Kosi River to the Mahananda Basin
Okay.
by linking it to the Mechi River. And to do this, they're going to remodel and extend the existing Eastern Kosi-Main Canal, or EKMC,
Okay.
which is part of the larger Kosi project that was started back in 1954 between India and Nepal.
Wow, so this Kosi project has been going on for a while.
It has. It was started to address the fact that the Kosi River has a history of changing its course dramatically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a very important project for the region.
So this PMKSY AIBP is part of a larger national initiative, right?
That's right. PMKSY is a big scheme that was launched in 2015-16
Okay.
with the goal of improving access to water for agriculture, expanding the area that has assured irrigation, improving water use efficiency at the farm level, and promoting sustainable water conservation.
Okay, so a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, it's very comprehensive, and the AIBP part of it was first launched in 1996-97,
Okay.
and then it became part of PMKSY in 2015-16.
Okay.
And it specifically focuses on providing financial assistance to big and medium-sized irrigation projects.
Right.
And it does this through the Long-Term Irrigation Fund, which is facilitated by NABARD.
Okay, can you give us a quick overview of where these rivers, the Kosi and the Mechi, are?
Sure. So the Kosi River starts in the Tibetan Plateau,
Okay.
flows through Nepal, and then enters Bihar before joining the Ganga River.
Okay.
Its main tributaries are the Sun Kosi, Arun Kosi, and Tamar Kosi.
Okay.
The Mechi River is to the east of the Kosi,
Okay.
and it's a tributary of the Mahananda River, which eventually flows into Bangladesh.
Okay, let's move on to something completely different, international collaboration in the area of food security.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting.
So ISRO and other space agencies have been recognized for their work on a food security initiative.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. So the Asian Food Security Information System, or AFS,
Okay.
has expressed its appreciation for the successful implementation of the Safe Agromet project,
Okay.
which ISRO and other space agencies were involved in.
That's wonderful. So what exactly is